Snow falls on stone that remembers screams. It is December 1942, and the courtyard of Auflag 4C, Colditz Castle, glows under floodlights that never sleep. German guards stamp their boots for warmth, Mauser rifles slung across gray greatcoats, while from the arched doorway of the prisoner's wing, a lone figure emerges carrying a folder, a cap, and the slow, deliberate posture of authority. He walks past the sentries as if he belongs to the Reich itself. The guards nod, salute, and open the great iron gate. The hinges groan like an old beast waking. Beyond lies the bridge over the Mulde River, a ribbon of frost leading to freedom. The man's breath curls in the air. Each step echoes louder than gunfire. He does not run. He does not look back. He simply crosses the bridge and vanishes into the whiteness. Inside the courtyard, an officer shouts his name, "Captain Reed!" But the echo comes back empty. Only the folder remains lying in the snow where he dropped it, stamped with the black eagle of the Wehrmacht and a single red word, genehmigt, approved. The guard who opened the gate blinks, uncertain. He believes it was an inspection. He believes it was permitted. He believes until the sirens wail, and thus began the legend of the man who walked out of Colditz front gate, because everyone thought it was a trick. Morning after the escape, guards hammer down corridors like wolves in polished boots. Whistles shriek, dogs bark, doors slam. In the officers' mess, coffee spills across a map as Commandant Oberst Schmidt smashes his fist onto the table. He walked out. "Walked out!" he roars, his voice shaking the frost from the rafters. Across the yard, British and Dutch officers are herded into formation, eyes half closed against the glare of snow. Some smile behind their scarves, because among them the name Pat Reed has already become myth. Reed was 33, Irish-born officer of the British Army, captured during the retreat from Calais in 1940. He had survived 3 camps before ending up in this medieval fortress-turned-prison. Colditz, perched on a cliff above the Mulde, its towers like black teeth against the winter sky, was the Germans' answer to incorrigible escape artists. It was said no man could leave its walls alive. The Germans believed that. The prisoners did not. Inside, corridors twisted like intestines through 6 centuries of stone. The air smelled of damp limestone, disinfectant, and boiled cabbage. Cells were small but not cruel, each with a bed, a shelf, a barred window opening onto nothing but rock. Yet what truly trapped them was not iron but distance, hundreds of miles from any neutral border surrounded by Germany itself. Reed had studied the castle the way an engineer studies a machine. Every hinge, every routine, every guard's habit became part of a blueprint that lived in his head. He knew when the gate opened for supply wagons, when officers came from Leipzig, when the guard commander changed shifts at exactly 12:50 p.m., and he knew one day the Germans' greatest weapon, their obedience to procedure, would become their weakness. In early 1942, the castle held prisoners of 12 nations, British, French, Dutch, Polish, even a handful of Czechs. They called themselves Colditzians. Days followed ritual, roll call at dawn, breakfast of ersatz coffee and black bread, lectures in the chapel, sport in the yard, music in the attic. But beneath that order beat a secret war. Beneath floorboards, men carved maps. In workshops, tin cans became compasses. Blankets became uniforms, piano wire became saw blades. Every laugh hid calculation. Reed's room overlooked the main gate. From that narrow window, he studied the rhythm of German life, the clicking heels of guards, the daily arrival of the post truck, the clerk carrying paperwork through the archway. Each time the gate opened, his pulse quickened. Freedom existed exactly 15 feet away, framed by stone and certainty. In March, a new shipment of uniforms arrived from Leipzig for the castle staff. Among them were 2 sets of officers' tunics, dark gray with silver piping. The quartermaster stored them in the tailoring room for alterations. Reed noticed. And one night, while a distraction drew the guards to another wing, he slipped in with a Dutch prisoner, Lieutenant Hans Larive. They worked by candlelight, matching insignia, copying stamps onto forged documents, pressing the German eagle into red wax using the back of a spoon heated over flame. By dawn, they had created an illusion so perfect it could open any door. But illusion needed confidence. "You can't sneak out of Colditz," Larive said. "You have to walk out." Reed smiled. "Then we'll walk." The following week, they began rehearsing. Reed memorized the body language of German officers, the clipped stride, the nod to sentries, the quick flash of papers. Larry drilled him for hours, barking commands in German until Reed answered instinctively. They timed every step from the inner courtyard to the bridge, 37 paces to freedom. But Colditz was alive, a breathing organism that felt its prisoner's intent. Guards sensed tension like sharks smell blood. On April 11th, when two Poles attempted a crawl through the chapel roof, they were caught. The castle buzzed with punishment. Reed bided his time, his heart coiled tighter. Then came the opportunity. A German officer named Major Rabe was expected from Leipzig for an inspection of Red Cross parcels. The commandant prepared paperwork, signed passes, scheduled the gate to open precisely at 16 hours. Reed watched the guards polish their boots and joked in German about efficiency. No one suspected the accent in his mouth had been trained by necessity. At 15:55, wearing the stolen uniform and carrying a leather folder stamped Dienstreise, official business, Reed stepped into the corridor. Larry followed in civilian overalls, pushing a trolley of files. The snow outside fell thick, muffling sound. The guard at the gate saluted automatically. Everything looked correct. Reed handed over the folder with a grunt. The sentry flipped through papers, saw stamps, signatures, even a note from the commandant's desk. Forged from memory. Satisfied, he nodded. The iron gate groaned open. Reed returned the salute, turned his collar against the cold, and walked out of the most secure prison in Nazi Germany, as if leaving an office. Inside, Larry turned the trolley and vanished back into the maze of corridors. By the time the guard realized no car waited beyond the bridge, the castle alarmed to life. Sirens cutting through snow like knives. Outside the walls, Reed walked fast but not hurried, following the frozen road toward Leipzig. The first kilometer was agony, every sound behind him a phantom shout. But no trucks came. The road wound through forest, branches heavy with snow. He ditched the folder, kept only the forged papers and a compass sewn into his cuff. His plan reached Switzerland over 400 kilometers away. Alone in enemy uniform, speaking imperfect German, he was a ghost among wolves. For 2 days he moved by night, sleeping in barns, stealing food from sheds. He avoided railways, following the Mulde south. Once he passed a group of German soldiers repairing telegraph lines. He nodded curtly and they saluted back. The uniform was magic, but magic that could kill him if the spell broke. On the third night, hunger forced him toward a small village near Zwickau. A tavern glowed faintly through frost. He needed warmth, perhaps a loaf of bread. He stepped inside, heart hammering. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned to the officer in gray. "Evening," he said in halting German. "Train to Leipzig, delayed by snow." The innkeeper nodded respectfully, poured him schnapps. For 10 minutes, Reed sat under the weight of their gaze, drinking courage. Then as he rose to leave, a young soldier approached. "Herr Hauptmann," the soldier said, "your accent." "Austrian?" Reed smiled thinly. "Dublin," he said, letting the foreignness sound like Tyrol. The soldier laughed. "Ah, the South." He clapped him on the shoulder and bought another round. When Reed finally slipped away, the innkeeper wished him safe travels. Outside, his knees buckled. He realized he had just survived his own execution by conversation. 2 weeks later, near the Swiss border, he encountered snow patrols combing the passes. He hid by day, moving through pines that whispered of ghosts. Frost crusted his boots. His hands were raw and bleeding. Once, a searchlight swept across the valley, catching him for an instant, but the beam moved on. He kept walking. The border lay somewhere beyond that ridge, a line invisible in the white. On the night of May 13, 1942, Reed crossed a frozen stream and felt his foot sink into soft snow. On the other side stood a simple wooden post marked with 3 letters, CH Switzerland. He fell to his knees, unable to breathe. The silence was complete, and no dogs, no engines, only wind and his own heartbeat. He was free. Back at Colditz, disbelief turned to grudging admiration. The Germans scoured the castle for accomplices, but no one spoke. Even the guards who had opened the gate refused to believe what they had done. To them, it had been official business. The commandant sent a furious telegram to Berlin. Prisoner escaped through main gate in uniform. Security breach total. The legend spread faster than the searchers. In POW huts across Europe, men whispered of the officer who walked out. The story became code, morale, defiance. Reed's escape proved that even the most perfect prison carried within it the seed of its own undoing: discipline. The Germans' blind faith in rules had opened their own gate. By the time word of Pat Reed's impossible escape reached the prisoner's attic at Colditz, the sound moved through stone like a heartbeat, each corridor carrying whispers that fed on disbelief until even the guards began repeating it as rumor. And in that rumor something dangerous was born, a belief that the walls were not immortal. In the cramped quarters of the British quarters, Captain David Sterling, Lieutenant Michael Sinclair, the Dutch flyer Hans Larive, and a dozen others sat beneath a flickering bulb studying the German routines as if dissecting a living animal. For if one man could walk through the gate, perhaps 10 could fly through its shadows. Colditz was meant for the hopeless but had become a university of escape. Every prisoner a professor of deceit. Every corridor a laboratory. The Germans tried to smother hope with inspections and searches, stripping the castle bare of contraband. Yet each discovery only proved how much had been hidden, how many miracles of ingenuity still pulsed beneath their noses. The secret radio in the clock tower, the tunnel dug under the theater, the forged papers printed on Red Cross parcel wrapping, the counterfeit ration stamps drawn with toothpaste and pencil lead. In the laundry room, a French officer brewed invisible ink from boiled onions. In the Polish quarters, men cut bed slats into skis for a plan to flee across snow. And above all of them, the British Escape Committee, the so-called X organization, recorded every shift of every guard, every sound of the castle at night until they knew its pulse better than the Germans themselves. Yet among them all, none burned brighter than Michael Sinclair, the restless red-haired lieutenant who refused to accept captivity as anything but a temporary inconvenience. He had been shot twice, already in failed escapes, and still smiled like a man who'd misplaced something trivial. The Germans nicknamed him Der Rote Fuchs, the Red Fox, and even their dogs seemed to fear his scent. When he heard of Reed's exit, he said quietly, "The gate has memory now. We'll open it again, but differently." And he set about planning a deception so audacious it bordered on lunacy, to impersonate not an officer, but a wounded guard being transferred to Leipzig Hospital. With the help of Dutch artist Antony de Vries, he painted scars with iodine, stained bandages with rust scraped from pipes, and practiced the limp of an injured man until even fellow prisoners offered him seats. Uniforms were scavenged from the laundry, badges forged from tin cut with razor blades, and passes reproduced from memory using blotting paper and ink distilled from burnt toast. They rehearsed by candlelight, timing each step from sickbay to the main courtyard, the rhythm of salute and response engraved in muscle. Outside, snow had melted into rain, and the river below the cliffs ran fat and brown. But inside the castle, hope hardened like steel. If Reed had walked into the snow, they would ride the current of that same impossible courage. On a gray morning in February 1943, Sinclair's chance came when the Germans conducted a medical convoy. Disguised under bandages, he was wheeled toward the gate by 2 comrades dressed as orderlies, his forged papers signed and stamped, his pulse steady as the guard sergeant checked his pass. Rain drummed against tin helmets, thunder rolling above the river, and for a moment it seemed the illusion would hold. But fate, capricious and cruel, had learned their scent. From the archway stepped the real Feldwebel whose signature graced the pass, his eyes narrowing as he read his own name. And in that breathless second the universe balanced on a heartbeat. Sinclair smiled, said something in German about efficiency, and when the sergeant blinked he lunged, tipping the wheelchair into him, sprinting for the gate. Shots cracked like lightning, echoing through the courtyard, boots pounding, dogs barking. The Red Fox ran not for freedom now, but for the dream itself. Across cobblestones slick with rain, through the archway where Reed had once walked calm as a ghost, and for one astonishing instant he cleared the gate. Then a single bullet found his back. He fell just beyond the threshold, rain pooling around his body, the castle lights blurring in his fading eyes. The Germans lifted him gently, almost reverently, for even they knew they had killed something greater than a man. Inside, his comrades watched from barred windows, faces pressed to glass, silent, unblinking. That night no one spoke, but the castle seemed to breathe slower, humbled as if aware that even death could not fully claim what had been attempted. Over the weeks that followed, escape fever burned hotter than ever, the Poles tunneling under the canteen, the French carving keys from soap and wire, the Dutch building a glider in the attic under the noses of their captors. The guards prowled with dogs, yet admiration crept into their discipline, a reluctant respect for men who fought with imagination rather than bullets. The war outside thundered on. Stalingrad had fallen, North Africa trembled. But within Colditz time stood still, each prisoner fighting not for territory but for the right to prove that bars were illusions. In March, a new arrival brought word that Pat Reed had reached England safely, working now for MI9 to help others escape, his face on secret posters distributed to camps as symbol of what was possible. Hearing it, even the most broken men straightened their backs, for the legend had returned to life. Yet freedom was not measured by miles beyond the wire. It lived in the defiance that turned despair into strategy, hunger into invention, captivity into art. By the year's end, there would be dozens more attempts, through sewers, roofs, cellars, and even the sky. And though most failed, each failure carved another crack in the myth of German infallibility. Colditz itself had become a character in the war, a stage where courage and madness performed the same act under different names. And in the cold nights when wind moaned through the towers, the guards swore they heard footsteps on the bridge, echoing softly, the ghost of the man who had once walked out the front gate because everyone thought it was a trick, and behind him, countless others following still. By 1944, the war outside had shifted like the tide, but inside Colditz time stood motionless except for the hum of creation rising from the attic, where dust motes danced in shafts of pale light, and two men, Flight Lieutenant Jack Best, an engineer, Bill Goldfinch, labored over an impossible dream, a glider, hand-built in secret above the chapel, its wings stretching across rafters older than the English language, the entire machine hidden from guards by a false wall of painted canvas and prayer. They called it the Colditz Cock, a name half defiance, half dark humor, because the bird that could not sing would fly instead. They worked with sawdust in their lungs, whispering measurements while hymns from the chapel below masked the sound of hammers. And each night they carried planks past German sentries disguised as theater props, because in Colditz everything dangerous hid behind art. The orchestra that concealed a radio, the play rehearsal that smuggled uniforms, the sculpture carved hollow to store a compass. From scavenged floorboards and bed slats they built ribs and spars. From bedsheets doped with porridge and casein, they stretched a skin so taut it shimmered like bone. And when the wind moaned through the tower vents, it sounded already like flight. Even the guards, hearing faint noises above, assumed it was rats or saints. Months passed, winter thickening into spring as Allied bombers thundered nightly overhead, their engines shaking the castle and showering dust on the silent craftsmen, who paused only to listen to freedom rumbling through the sky. By then the escape committee had changed strategy. Not single men running for borders, but a symbol that would carry them all. Best believed that if they could launch from the roof into the valley of the Mulde, they might reach the riverbank and the forest beyond, from which American lines lay scarcely a week's march. It was madness, beautiful and pure, but madness had always been Colditz's native tongue. To move the glider parts into position, they disguised them as coffin lids for a staged play about Macbeth, guards laughing as they helped carry the props, unaware they were carrying wings. Every bolt, every rope, every measurement was tested again and again, until by early 1945 the glider was complete. 17 feet of pine and linen crouched under the attic beams like a myth waiting for faith. Outside, Germany was collapsing. Refugees clogged the roads. Sirens screamed endlessly from Leipzig. And in April, the thunder of artillery rolled from the west like a storm announcing judgment. The prisoners knew liberation was near, but the idea of waiting felt unbearable after years of resistance lived, minute by minute. Best and Goldfinch decided that if freedom did not reach them soon, they would fly to meet it. On the final week before American tanks appeared on the horizon, they prepared the launch platform above the chapel window, a wooden ramp greased with soap, sandbags for ballast, ropes tied to steel hooks, all calculated by slide rule and instinct. Below, guards packed their belongings, radios crackled with chaos, orders came and vanished, and through it all the two airmen worked in silence, their hands steady, their faces illuminated by the same cold light that had once touched the Wright brothers. When at last the ramp was ready, they painted the glider's nose with a single symbol, the Union Jack, hand-drawn in chalk, fading even as it was made. The plan was simple and impossible. 2 men would climb aboard, a third would cut the restraining rope, and gravity itself would decide their fate. Yet history, merciful or jealous, intervened. On the morning they chose for flight, the castle commander announced the war's end, Germany's surrender within days, and forbade further guard patrols. The air smelled of smoke and lilac, the sound of guns distant but dying, and Best stood at the attic window staring at the valley that might have been his runway. Too late, he whispered, and smiled, because the dream had already served its purpose. When the Americans arrived, they found the glider perfectly intact, hidden behind its false wall, wings folded like a sleeping bird. Engineers measured it with awe, calling it a miracle of improvisation. Newspapers later called it the last great escape that never flew, but to the men of Colditz it had already flown 1,000 times in their minds during the nights when the wind beat against the shutters, and hope was the only thing that refused to die. The castle that once devoured courage now echoed with laughter and disbelief, and as Allied flags rose over the towers, the prisoners watched the guards march out under escort. Roles reversed, but dignity preserved. For a brief, surreal hour, both sides stood together in the courtyard under rain and sunlight, and someone began to hum the old RAF tune, "Bless 'em all," voices joining from every nation until even the Germans sang along, their accents clumsy but sincere. Above them, the attic door creaked open one last time, dust spilling through the air like memory, and the glider waited in its hiding place, untouched, eternal, proof that imagination could carve wings even from captivity. When the Americans dismantled it for transport, they left a note on the beam where it had rested. Built by men who refused to crawl. And in that single sentence, the entire spirit of Colditz lived on. When the guns finally fell silent over Saxony, and the thunder of the front drifted eastward like the receding tide of a storm, Colditz Castle stood half in ruin and half in disbelief, its walls streaked with soot, its courtyards littered with broken helmets, splintered wagons, and the silence of men who had survived too long to know what survival meant. The guards had vanished overnight, leaving rifles stacked like crosses against the gate, and for the first time in 5 years the prisoners walked the courtyard uncounted, breathing air unmeasured by roll call. The great iron door that had been the mouth of their captivity now hung open, its lock smashed, and yet no one crossed the threshold, as though freedom itself were an illusion too fragile to touch. Captain David Sterling wandered beneath the archway where Pat Reed had once vanished into snow, running his hand along the cold stone as if tracing the scar of the war carved into it, while Jack Best climbed to the attic and found the empty space where the glider had rested, a clean rectangle on the dusty floor like the shadow of a ghost that had already flown. Outside the walls, the Mulde River carried the reflection of smoke from villages still burning, and the air stank of wet ash and diesel, but above it all the spring sky gleamed an impossible blue. When the first American jeeps rolled across the bridge, the men did not cheer. They simply watched in silence, their faces pale, eyes unblinking, as if afraid that sound might wake them from a dream. The liberating soldiers stared back in awe at the thin, unshaven figures who saluted them with perfect precision, prisoners who looked more like saints of endurance than soldiers of war. Paperwork followed liberation as surely as it had followed imprisonment. Names logged, ranks confirmed, medical reports written on trembling typewriters, but the reality was simpler. Men who had given years to defiance now had no idea where to go. In the mess hall, once a theater of mock dinners and whispered conspiracies, British, Dutch, Polish, and French officers sat at wooden tables covered with coffee cups and maps of home they could no longer recognize. Hans Larive traced the shape of Holland with a finger blackened by grease, whispering, "We're free, but the world is gone," while Goldfinch sketched the glider for an American correspondent who promised to send engineers from Boeing to see it, his pencil shaking with both pride and disbelief. That night, under the same moon that had watched every failed escape, they held a small service in the courtyard, candles trembling in the wind, each man speaking a single name of someone who had not returned. The flame guttering slightly each time a syllable touched the air. There were so many names that dawn came before they finished. and when the sun rose, it caught the castle's towers in light for the first time, unfiltered by barbed wire. Yet liberation was not the end. It was a new kind of captivity, the slow return to a world that had moved on. Pat Reed, now back in London with MI9, returned to Colditz months later as an observer and found it empty except for pigeons nesting in the rafters and graffiti scrawled on the walls. Dates, jokes, prayers, coordinates to nowhere. He walked through the corridors, the air thick with dust and memory, and in the commandant's office he found the iron key to the main gate, still hanging on a nail. He took it not as trophy but as testament. Outside on the bridge he stopped and looked back, seeing the castle not as a prison but as a monument to every kind of endurance. Discipline, rebellion, madness, faith. When he dropped the key into the river, it vanished with a small ripple, like the war itself slipping into history. Later, when reporters asked what Colditz had meant, he answered simply, "It was proof that even behind walls, a man can still move forward." And in that sentence lived the truth of all who had passed through its gates. Men who turned captivity into a canvas for courage, who built wings out of hunger, who walked into the unknown carrying only imagination. By the time autumn returned and ivy began to creep once more across the courtyard stones, the castle had become quiet again, watching over a valley reborn from ruin, the echo of boots replaced by the laughter of children playing where guards once stood, and the ghosts of the old prisoners lingering not as sorrow but as instruction. At night, when wind rolled through the empty corridors, it carried the faint murmur of pages turning, the soft clatter of wooden wheels, and perhaps, if one listened closely, the sound of steady footsteps crossing the bridge toward freedom, never hurried, never afraid, because someone once had shown that it could be done. When the men of Colditz scattered back into the world, the war was over, but the battle to remember had only begun. For freedom after too much captivity feels like a wound that cannot close, and in every pub, hospital ward, and embassy office where former prisoners gathered in the years that followed, the talk always turned back to that castle on the cliff, to the smell of damp stone and cabbage, to the echo of boots in corridors and the laughter that had kept them human. Pat Reed, now an officer in MI9's escape bureau, spent his nights writing by lamplight, turning memories into maps, diagrams into testimony, each line a bridge for those who would come later, and wonder how defiance could survive in chains. When his book was published, it was less a memoir than a requiem, and across the world readers saw for the first time what the inside of courage looked like. Gray, hungry, absurd, and unbreakable. Others could not write at all. Michael Sinclair was buried in a German cemetery, his name etched beside the dates of an unfinished life, while Hans Larive returned to the Netherlands to find his city bombed flat, his family scattered. Yet in the ruins they built again, because rebuilding was its own form of escape. The castle itself passed from army to army, first American, then Polish, then Soviet, each leaving new scars on its stones, until at last it was abandoned to pigeons and silence. Ivy crawled over the barred windows. Weeds split the courtyard cobbles, and for decades the world forgot it except for those who had once plotted miracles within its walls. In the 1960s, a film crew arrived to recreate Reed's escape. Actors in crisp uniforms retracing the steps that had once meant death, and the townspeople watched from the bridge as cameras rolled where real footsteps had echoed, some weeping, some laughing, all unable to tell where history ended and legend began. By then, the real survivors were gray-haired men with medals they never asked for, sitting in drawing rooms surrounded by grandchildren who could not imagine a world without light. When they spoke of Colditz, they did not describe hunger or fear but detail. The weight of a forged pass, the sound of paper creasing, the exact smell of rain on the day the gate opened. For them, the war had become a collection of sensations, each one proof that they had once existed beyond the logic of survival. In 1996, when the castle was finally restored and opened as a museum, the remaining veterans stood together once more in the courtyard, their breath white in the winter air, listening to the guides explain how this place had been a symbol of resilience. None of them corrected the story. They simply smiled because truth and myth were brothers here, sharing the same heartbeat. Pat Reed, by then old and frail, touched the wall near the main gate and whispered to no one, "We never escaped it, we just carried it with us." And the wind that swept through the archway seemed to answer. Today, tourists walk the same corridors, cameras flashing where guards once marched, and in the attic, restored beams frame an empty space where the glider once lay, a replica wing suspended in silence, the air thick with memory. When schoolchildren ask how anyone could endure such confinement, the guide points to that open window above the valley and says, "Because even stone cannot imprison imagination." Outside, the Mulde River still runs beneath the bridge, cold and indifferent, carrying reflections of sky and history together. And if you stand there at dusk, when fog climbs from the water and the town bells echo through the gorge, you might see, just for a breath, a figure in a gray coat walking calmly toward the gate, folder under arm, snow gathering on his shoulders. A salute exchanged in the stillness, the iron hinges sighing open to let him pass, and then he is gone again into the mist, leaving only footprints that melt into legend, the everlasting rhythm of defiance whispering through the stones of Colditz, proof that the strongest prison ever built by man was never strong enough to hold a single determined dream.